There is a certain beauty in tragedy that's hard to find in other genres. Romance provides a beautiful but often unrealistic world, while the heroes in action tend to be too good to be real. But tragedy stands us in front of the darkness of the real pain and fears we bear within without mercy. Tragedy is one of the earliest of literary genres. Its origin dates back to ancient Greece, where it evolved along with comedy into a dramatic genre revolving around personal destruction. Tragic heroes would often find themselves at the mercy of ruthless gods, happenstance, or the consequences of their own decisions. According to Aristotle, the tragic hero is, quote, a great man who is neither a paragon of virtue and justice, nor undergoes the change to misfortune through any real badness or wickedness, but because of some mistake, end of quote. Nowadays, tragedy is most commonly associated with something out of our hands. The tragic hero is stricken by a seemingly unjust world that punishes him despite his goodness. In some cases, the hero gives in and turns into a villain as a result. In other cases, the hero resists despite the tragedy. The pursuit of a higher meaning is the only beacon of light that remains for him. But because it's tragedy, his good deeds are never rewarded by what his heart most yearns for. Nietzsche regarded the genre of tragedy as the greatest achievement and the peak and glamour of the Greek culture. He saw this coming together of the Dionysian and Apollonian elements in tragedy, which transcended the nihilism of a fundamentally meaningless world. He saw tragedy as a means for transformation into the Übermensch, from a simple man that gives into the pain inevitably associated with life. Although Spider-Man manages to save thousands of strangers, those who mean the most to him are sacrificed so that others may live. His beloved are lost so that complete strangers, including those who hate him, may live. An ultimate act of selflessness that, however, costs one's own self. Spider-Man isn't a hero defined by his superpowers. His life is defined by an incessant overcoming of tragedy that can never be separated from the life he leads. Despite the perpetual loss, he goes on and struggles his way through, with the cursed gift his strength represents.
But you can't quit! Just because you did one bad thing, you never quit! That's why you're my hero!
He's the very definition of the word hero, the one who isn't defined by the external power he wields, but by the inner strength thanks to which he can use this power creatively, not destructively. A death you can never escape. A common theme in tragedy is that the tragic hero is trapped within a tragic cycle, or that the tragedy is inherent in the given universe. Spider-Man is a virtuous character destined for downfall. Tragedy is something he can never escape despite the fact that he rarely makes mistakes. In that sense, protagonists like Guts from Berserk or Geralt from The Witcher are shaped into more realistic tragic heroes. They make mistakes, they give in to their anger, and the consequences of their actions follow them. However, upon closer look, there isn't much difference in moral terms between the two types of characters. It only makes them more human and realistic, but the unfairness of tragedy remains the same. This brings us to the most important question. If the tragic hero cannot escape the tragedy, what difference do his actions make? This may be the question we ask ourselves every day in our own lives, and now even more than before. In nihilistic tragedies such as Kafka's or Sartre's works, tragedy consumes the individual. In terms of Jungian psychology, the ego is depleted of energy and makes no attempt at pushing against the element that causes it, thus falling into depression. Something similar can be found in dystopia. The difference is that nihilistic tragedy produces a despondent world and a despondent hero, whereas dystopian heroes often seek ways to combat despondency. In a similar fashion, the tragic hero, in spite of often being extinguished by tragedy time and again, doesn't give in to it until the very end, thanks to the faith in something that transcends the tragedy. He becomes either an existentialist, such as Guts or Batman, or has faith in something higher, such as Spider-Man. This element has been present in tragedy ever since the oldest plays, such as Antigone. Tragedy as a formative element. With tragedy, an opportunity to integrate our shadow arises. At the same time, it provides us with the resilience needed to become the hero the world needs. Peter loses his uncle because he gives in to his shadow. This tragic event gives him an opportunity to overcome his shadow by letting go of the revenge he so desires. Peter Parker was burdened with responsibility he wasn't ready for, but he accepted to carry his cross. This burden is what shaped him, but also what blinded him. He either sought ways to get rid of it or take it on fully. Whenever he tried to achieve any balance, it ended in a tragedy. In a way, this is exactly the message of Spider-Man, in a rather Nietzschean fashion. The life you desire to live will inevitably become tragedy at one point or another. You are like Sisyphus, that pushes his stone onward, forever, despite it falling constantly. We can see how paradoxical it is in Spider-Man's story. He loses the ones he loves the most, while managing to save the rest of the world. Yes saying. In virtually any Spider-Man universe, Spider-Man loses those he loves the most. Gwen Stacy, Uncle Ben, Aunt May, Harry, etc. Despite the inner conflicts this generates, Spider-Man never gives in to the tragedy. He says yes to life through constant overcoming in a Nietzschean fashion, despite having no goal left to reach. His meaning lies in the protection of the feeble human life. Paradoxically, he protects something he can never even get close to, not to mention attain. What Nietzsche says is that we should embrace the way things are, but more often than not, we simply don't have any other choice. If Peter Parker turned against life, he would become the thing he was fighting against. He would become that what took his loved ones away. If he simply gave up, it would mean that he lost his loved ones for nothing. He has to keep going because there is no better alternative. We can either perish or go on. There is no middle ground. This is played out very clearly in both heroes and villains in the Spider-Man universe. The Goblin is the result of the shadow consuming the whole persona. All this makes Spider-Man somewhat special, even religious and transcendental. What Spider-Man lives for becomes faith in the high principle of good. It gets to the point where Spider-Man no longer exists for any other reason than to be the savior of strangers. In a sense, moral hesitancy is not only no longer present, but its presence is irrelevant. What's right becomes set in stone, and its protection becomes simply part of oneself. When Peter overcomes the inner conflict and resentment, his self disappears, and all that remains is his unity with the good. That's, however, not necessarily a good thing. Although tragedy pushes Peter to grow up, this opportunity becomes lost. Peter remains an innocent child in a harsh world, a Peter Pan that refuses to grow up. I have to say that tragedy is my favourite genre because it's most realistic and relatable. I think our beloved heroes are so close to our heart because we glimpse a bit of ourselves in them. When God is betrayed by Griffith and loses everything, when Anakin sacrifices the whole world to save his beloved Padme, but fails miserably, when Kaneki loses his sanity when faced with losing again and again, we see ourselves. What makes tragedy truly transformative is to see the pieces of the former self of the hero to slowly reassemble. When God fights the apostles time and time again, when Darth Vader saves his son from perdition, when Kaneki unites two split worlds, it gives us hope that maybe in our own tragedy there is a glimmer of hope. And that hope is our own ability to conjure up strength. Psychology. At the end of the day, Spider-Man's perseverance could be reduced to the result of the guilt he feels inside. Due to his virtuous personality, he takes the blame for the deaths of those around him onto himself. This brings us once again to the powerlessness of a tragic character. He must go on so that he can find redemption in something. In Peter's case, it's in the enactment of good deeds. In a way, this leads to a form of asceticism. He renounces personal desires in order to be able to become the saviour. Carl Jung used the term puer aeternus, which means eternal youth, to describe a man who is charming, affectionate and creative, but remains trapped within the fantasy of his dreams characteristic of adolescence. Peter doesn't see himself as a saviour, but he believes he must act as one, which is an unconscious form of the Messiah complex characteristic of puer aeternus. He cannot maintain relationships because there is always the but that prevents any kind of commitment. Carl Jung said that the cure for puer aeternus is work, with its ups and downs. What puer aeternus fears the most is the boring routine. Adventure is therefore what he constantly seeks out in order to avoid it. We see that symbolically in Peter getting fired from every boring but necessary job he has, such as pizza delivery. He's either a scientist or superhero, with no space for boredom. Although Peter certainly learned to understand responsibility, he's unable to choose between his two realities and settle down with one.
It's the hard choices I'm always having to make. I just can't handle it anymore.
Characteristic of the puer aeternus is the inability to choose, for to choose means to sacrifice. We can't have everything in this world, and unless we learn to sacrifice something, nothing will ever be certain. Uncertainty means chaos, and chaos leads to madness. Peter can't ever fully embrace being Spider-Man or being Peter, and is stuck somewhere in the limbo, which prevents the achievement of the full individuation. One would expect that tragedy is the element that would force him to choose, but the point of Spider-Man's story is, after all, to express the duality between the conscious, or Peter, and the unconscious, or Spider-Man. Symbolism. The idea of Spider-Man is an interesting one in itself. Most people hate spiders and some fear them excessively. It clearly has a biological underpinning. Spiders can be poisonous or swarm the bodily apertures. Symbolically, however, spiders symbolize the unconscious we so dread. If you're interested in what spiders can mean in movies, check out my video about the movie Enemy. Otto Rank, one of the most interesting psychoanalytic thinkers, ascribed the fear of insects to the fear of returning back to the womb, into the unconscious. The spider is deemed to be the symbol of the dreaded mother in whose net one is caught. In other words, the individual in question fears failing the process of individuation, the process of forming one's own unique self separate from the parents and falling back into the times of non-existence. The becoming of Spider-Man is Peter's readiness for individuation. He embraces the journey towards responsibility and begins to learn to deal with the real world along with the pain it inflicts. At the same time, he overcomes his nothingness, so to speak. A seemingly uninteresting, introverted geek, overseen by everyone, transforms into a powerful superhero. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. If you like my content, please consider supporting me on Patreon.